Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer regarding the legal, financial, and historical subject matter we are about to explore in this deep dive. The information presented in this video and throughout this entire series is intended strictly for educational, historical analysis, and entertainment purposes only. It absolutely does not constitute professional legal counsel, financial advisement, marital counseling, or psychiatric help. Family law, divorce proceedings, alimony statutes, and asset division regulations are highly jurisdictional and vary wildly not only from state to state, but have drastically evolved from the historical period we are analyzing today. The historical trends, case studies, and survival strategies discussed in relation to the United States Great Depression are a reflection of a vastly different legal era, specifically preceding the advent of modern no-fault divorce laws. You must never attempt to apply 1930s legal loopholes, courtroom tactics, or financial maneuvers to modern jurisprudence. Any discussion of potential outcomes or legal leverage is based entirely on historical precedent and sociological data from the era, rather than any prediction of how a contemporary family court might rule. If you are currently facing a divorce, a separation, or severe financial distress, it is your absolute responsibility to conduct your own due diligence and seek the immediate consultation of a licensed attorney and a certified financial planner operating within your specific jurisdiction. In the immediate aftermath of October 1929, the United States economy did not merely stumble, it completely shattered, taking with it the foundational structures of the American family. If you look at the official census and legal data from the early 1930s, you will notice a bizarre and highly misleading statistic. Right at the peak of the absolute worst economic suffering, the official legal divorce rate in America actually plummeted by roughly 25%. On paper, it looked as though the sheer trauma of the Great Depression was forcing husbands and wives to band together, put aside their differences, and weather the devastating storm as a unified front. But the dark, unspoken reality of the era paints a terrifyingly different picture. Marriages were not surviving the Depression. They were imploding at an unprecedented rate under the crushing weight of unemployment, starvation, and the sudden violent loss of the male identity as the sole breadwinner. The reason the official divorce rate dropped was not because of marital harmony, but because a legal divorce in 1932 was an absolute luxury of the rich. Hiring a lawyer, filing the immense amount of fault-based paperwork, and navigating the incredibly strict judicial systems of the time cost money that simply did not exist. Instead, a massive silent epidemic swept across the country, a phenomenon that sociologists and historians came to call the poor man's divorce. Hundreds of thousands of American men, utterly stripped of their dignity, unable to find work, and facing daily hostility in homes where the tension could be cut with a knife, simply walked out the front door to look for employment and never returned. They boarded freight trains, changed their names, crossed state lines, and vanished into the vast expanse of the Hoovervilles and transient camps out west. But this mass exodus created a catastrophic legal web. Because these men never legally dissolved their marriages, they remained legally bound to the debts of their spouses, permanently vulnerable to future prosecution for desertion, and entirely paralyzed from ever legally rebuilding their lives, purchasing property, or remarrying without committing bigamy. And here is the truly shocking part that we are going to unpack. The men who chose to stay and fight their way through the collapsing court system discovered a series of brutal, highly specific legal strategies to protect what little they had left. The financial warfare waged in the divorce courts of the 1930s established the very foundations of the brutal family law systems you see today. And the absolute biggest, most devastating mistake men made when trying to separate in 1933 is the exact same catastrophic error that men make in family courts right now in the modern era. We are going to reveal exactly what that legal trap is, how the courts used it to extract generational wealth, and why understanding this specific historical mechanism could completely alter how you view marital assets today. You are about to embark on a comprehensive masterclass detailing exactly how men navigated the total destruction of their marriages during the worst financial crisis in modern human history. We are not just going to talk about the history, we are going to dissect the specific step-by-step strategies that men used to survive when the banks collapsed, when their life savings evaporated overnight, and when the legal system was uniquely weaponized against the working class. For the modern American man, the lessons buried in the rubble of the Great Depression are not just historical curiosities. They are an urgent, vital blueprint for survival. Today we are seeing massive economic uncertainty, skyrocketing inflation, mass corporate layoffs, and a cost of living crisis that puts an unbearable, suffocating strain on modern marriages. The undeniable reality is that financial stress remains the primary catalyst for divorce, and when the economy contracts, the battle over remaining resources becomes ruthless. By deeply analyzing the case studies of men who face the absolute worst-case scenario, losing their jobs, their homes, and their marriages all at the exact same time, you will gain a profound, bulletproof understanding of leverage, negotiation, and emotional endurance. We will explore how men handled the brutal reality of fault-based divorce, where proving cruelty, adultery, or abandonment was required to break the contract. We will look at how the total deflation of the US dollar completely inverted the concept of alimony, turning what was once a manageable payment into a lifelong debt prison. We will examine the exact ways men successfully shielded their remaining capital when the banking system itself could not be trusted, and how custody was determined when neither parent had a permanent physical address. This is about stripping away the emotion and looking at the cold, hard mechanics of legal and financial survival in an environment engineered to break you. Whether you are currently navigating a high-conflict divorce, trying to protect your assets in an unpredictable economy, or simply seeking to understand the harsh realities of how the legal system functions during a macroeconomic collapse, the historical trends and potential outcomes we are about to decode will equip you with a perspective that very few men possess. You are going to learn how to operate strategically when everything around you is falling apart. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of the legal trap that swallowed thousands of men during the Great Depression, we must completely erase our modern understanding of how a marriage ends. Imagine if, right now in the year 2026, you could not simply file for divorce because you were unhappy. Imagine a legal reality where irreconcilable differences did not exist on paper. In the early 1930s, the entire United States operated under a strictly fault-based divorce system. This meant that for a marriage to be legally dissolved, a specific severe matrimonial offense had to be committed, proven in a court of law, and entered into the permanent public record. The acceptable grounds for separation were extremely rigid, typically limited to extreme physical cruelty, prolonged criminal desertion, or adultery. This framework created a highly adversarial, theatrical, and deeply destructive courtroom environment. When the stock market crashed and the economy collapsed, financial ruin swept through American households, destroying marriages by the thousands. But severe financial distress was not a legal ground for divorce. A wife could not simply petition the court to leave her husband because he had lost his job at the steel mill, or because the family farm was foreclosed upon by the bank. To escape a poverty-stricken marriage, one party had to manufacture a fault, and in the overwhelming majority of these historical case studies, the blame was legally engineered to fall squarely on the shoulders of the husband. This legal environment forced the emergence of highly orchestrated collusion, a desperate strategy where couples would stage elaborate, entirely fabricated scenarios just to satisfy the incredibly strict requirements of the presiding judge. Men would hire professional witnesses and rent hotel rooms to be caught in compromising positions, willingly destroying their own public reputations in their communities simply to untangle themselves from a dead marriage. But this complex legal theater was only possible if both parties were cooperating. If the separation was highly contested, which became increasingly common as societal desperation set in, the courtroom turned into an absolute financial bloodbath. Let us examine a typical historical scenario, looking at a composite case study of a man we will call Arthur, a mid-level manager living in Chicago. In 1928, the economy is booming, and Arthur is experiencing a standard contentious separation. The court reviews his stable income and assigns a standard alimony payment of $100 a month. In a prosperous economy, this is a heavy burden, but it is manageable. Then comes the catastrophic crash of October 1929. The financial markets implode. By 1931, Arthur has completely lost his job. His life savings are permanently trapped inside a collapsed local bank, and his earning potential has been completely eradicated. But the court order demanding $100 a month remains exactly the same. This introduces one of the most terrifying financial phenomenons of the Great Depression, a concept that completely destroyed men who were caught inside the family court system. That phenomenon is severe economic deflation. During the early years of the Depression, the national money supply shrank drastically, meaning the purchasing power of a single dollar skyrocketed, while wages and asset prices plummeted. Debts, however, remained rigidly fixed. A fixed alimony payment of $100 in 1932 was financially equivalent to paying an absolute fortune. The financial burden had effectively doubled or tripled in real terms, while Arthur now possessed an income that had dropped to absolute zero. Modern men navigating unpredictable inflation in the year 2026 face a scenario where their money buys less. But during the Great Depression, men faced a devastating deflationary spiral where the physical dollars required to pay their court-ordered debts simply ceased to exist in the local economy. The family courts of that era were utterly ruthless and completely unsympathetic to the macroeconomic collapse. Judges routinely refused to modify alimony orders, viewing a man lacking the ability to pay not as a tragedy of the Depression, but as a deliberate, malicious evasion of his legal duties. When men like Arthur inevitably defaulted on these mathematically impossible payments, the courts did not offer grace periods, mediation, or debt restructuring plans. They utilized the blunt force instrument of civil contempt. Thousands of formerly middle-class, law-abiding men were aggressively hunted down by local sheriffs, arrested and thrown into overcrowded county jails alongside violent criminals simply for being unemployed and unable to pay their spousal support. They were literally imprisoned for debt, an archaic legal practice that was fully weaponized during the economic crisis. This created a horrific procedural cycle. A man could not earn money to pay his alimony while locked inside a jail cell, and the presiding judge would adamantly refuse to release him until the massive arrears were paid in full. The psychological devastation of this cycle was absolute. The societal expectation of the era firmly entrenched the man as the sole, invincible provider. When the collapsed economy stripped men of their ability to provide, and the legal system simultaneously criminalized their poverty, the traditional concept of masculinity fractured under the pressure. Faced with the terrifying prospect of a debtor prison, a massive demographic of American men realized that attempting to navigate the formal legal system was a highly probable path to total financial ruin. This realization triggered a staggering demographic shift, a mass exodus of husbands leaving their homes in the dead of night to ride the freight trains westward. But legal desertion was a criminal offense, and it left the transient man permanently looking over his shoulder. The authorities actively pursued these men across state lines, often using newly established federal resources. If a man fled to California to pick fruit in the agricultural valleys, he lived in constant, daily fear that a letter from a vindictive spouse back in Ohio would lead to his sudden arrest, interstate extradition, and immediate incarceration. For the men who understood the extreme danger of both the formal court system and the transient lifestyle, a third path had to be strategically forged. These men recognized that to survive a highly adversarial divorce in a collapsing economy, they had to radically alter their relationship with capital, physical assets, and legal ownership. They began to study the intricate loopholes in local property laws. They learned how to legally distance themselves from their own wealth, utilizing obscure trust structures, strategic debt accumulation, and the quiet conversion of vulnerable paper assets into untraceable physical commodities, long before a divorce petition could even be filed. They were engaging in high-level, desperate financial warfare, anticipating the legal strike and protecting their leverage. However, the opposing legal counsel quickly caught on to these covert survival tactics. In response to men successfully shielding their remaining wealth from the devastating deflationary alimony trap, a new, incredibly aggressive legal countermeasure was developed by family law attorneys in the mid-1930s. It was a courtroom tactic so effective and so devastating that it completely bypassed traditional asset protection strategies, allowing the courts to forcefully seize a man's future, unrealized potential, locking him into a system of endless financial extraction. This specific legal mechanism is still actively buried deep within the DNA of modern family law today, and if you do not know exactly how to identify it, you are entirely vulnerable to the exact same trap. Next, we are going to dissect this specific ruthless maneuver, how it was executed in the courtrooms, and exactly what you must understand about your own financial vulnerabilities before you ever step foot inside a courtroom. The legal maneuver that completely revolutionized asset extraction during the Great Depression is a concept that still strikes absolute terror into the hearts of modern legal scholars, and it is known as imputed income based on historical earning capacity. To understand how devastating this was, we have to look at the exact moment the legal system realized men were successfully hiding their remaining wealth. When the banks collapsed in late 1929, smart men immediately liquidated whatever paper assets they had left. They pulled their cash from failing institutions, converted it into physical commodities, or quietly transferred ownership to distant relatives. When these men were eventually dragged into divorce court in 1932, they would stand before the presiding judge, turn out their empty pockets, and declare total financial bankruptcy. Under traditional legal logic, you cannot extract blood from a stone. If there are no physical assets to divide and no current income to garnish, the opposing counsel should theoretically be left entirely empty-handed. But the highly incentivized family law attorneys of the 1930s were absolutely not going to let a massive national economic depression stop the flow of alimony judgments. They engineered a ruthless and highly calculated pivot. Instead of arguing over what a man currently possessed in his bank account in the present day, they began arguing over what that man was theoretically capable of earning based on his past performance during the prosperous years of the Roaring Twenties. They shifted the entire legal battleground from present reality to historical precedent. Let us look at a deeply revealing case study to illustrate this exact mechanism. Consider a man named Robert, a formerly successful automotive plant manager living in Detroit. In 1928, Robert was making a fantastic salary, providing a high standard of living for his family, and accumulating significant status. By 1932, the automotive industry has completely halted. Robert is laid off, his life savings are wiped out by bank runs, and he is standing in municipal breadlines just to survive. His wife files for a fault-based divorce, claiming severe mental cruelty to satisfy the rigid laws of the era. Robert walks into court assuming that his total financial ruin will at least protect him from an exorbitant alimony judgment. He presents undeniable proof of his unemployment. He shows the judge that the local factories are padlocked and hiring has permanently ceased. But the opposing counsel executes the earning capacity trap with lethal precision. The lawyer stands up and presents Robert's employment records and bank ledgers from 1928. The lawyer forcefully argues that Robert is a highly skilled, able-bodied man who is simply choosing not to find work in order to spite his wife and maliciously evade his legal financial responsibilities. The lawyer introduces the devastating legal argument of voluntary underemployment. The judge, bound by the rigid societal norms that viewed men solely as infallible providers, completely ignores the macroeconomic reality of the Great Depression. The judge rules that Robert's temporary unemployment does not erase his intrinsic value as a high earner. Consequently, the court imputes an income to Robert. They legally pretend that he is still making his 1928 salary, and they calculate his permanent alimony payments based entirely on phantom money that does not exist in the real world. Imagine if you are navigating a highly contentious divorce right now, in the current year 2026. Imagine you have just been caught in a massive wave of corporate layoffs. Your specific tech industry is contracting rapidly, and you are surviving on rapidly depleting emergency savings. Now imagine walking into a family courtroom, presenting your termination letter and severance package details to the judge, only to have your spouse's attorney hand the judge your tax returns from 2024, back when you had a massive six-figure salary, annual bonuses, and vesting stock options. Imagine the judge looking you directly in the eye and ordering you to pay thousands of dollars a month in spousal support, based entirely on a job title you no longer hold and an economic environment that has completely evaporated. If you fail to pay this newly assigned debt, you face immediate civil contempt of court, the aggressive seizure of whatever small assets you have left, and potential incarceration. This is not a dystopian fiction or a rare edge case. This is the exact legal weapon forged in the fires of the Great Depression, and it remains one of the most destructive and commonly utilized forces in modern family law today. The burden of proof during these historical proceedings was completely inverted against the husband. A man was legally presumed guilty of hiding assets or deliberately avoiding gainful employment until he could unequivocally prove otherwise. But how do you mathematically prove to a hostile court that you cannot find a job when the national unemployment rate is sitting at a staggering 25%? How do you prove a negative to a judge who is politically incentivized to keep divorced women off the local public assistance rolls? You simply could not do it. The state welfare systems during the Great Depression were entirely overwhelmed and collapsing. Local municipalities were going bankrupt under the weight of sheer poverty. Judges were under immense, unspoken political pressure from local governments to ensure that the financial burden of a separated wife fell entirely on the husband, regardless of his actual financial state, rather than allowing that financial burden to fall on the local taxpayers and state infrastructure. This created a terrifying nightmare scenario where a man's past success became his absolute greatest legal liability. The harder you had worked before the economic crash, the higher the imaginary income the court would impute upon you. Men who had spent a decade relentlessly climbing the corporate ladder or building successful small businesses were penalized with mathematically insurmountable debt structures, while men who had always been historically impoverished faced slightly more lenient judgments simply because their historical baseline was lower. Your past ambition was literally weaponized to destroy your future. When men finally realized that emptying their bank accounts, living in poverty, and proving their current unemployment was no longer enough to protect them from the family court system, a massive wave of strategic panic set in. They understood that the local courts were completely rigged against them, operating as an unstoppable extraction machine that demanded phantom money under the direct threat of the debtor's prison. To survive this inescapable trap, men had to realize that fighting the battle on their home turf was a highly probable defeat. They had to look beyond their city limits, beyond their state lines, and exploit a massive, glaring vulnerability in the United States Constitution regarding state sovereignty and legal jurisdiction. If the local jurisdiction was going to crush them with imputed income and archaic fault-based laws, the only logical strategic solution was to completely change the jurisdiction itself. This desperate realization birthed one of the most fascinating and legally controversial migrations in American history. Men began to discover that while the laws in places like New York, Pennsylvania, or Illinois were entirely weaponized against them, there were highly isolated, remote states out west that were actively undermining the entire national legal system for their own economic gain. These rogue states recognized the sheer desperation of millions of American men and decided to sell them a legal escape hatch, creating a massive, highly lucrative industry built entirely on the concept of the migratory divorce. We are about to map out exactly how this underground legal network operated, the specific geographical loopholes these men exploited to completely erase their local court judgments overnight, and why understanding the absolute power of jurisdictional leverage is the single most critical concept you must master before your opponent even files the initial paperwork. To understand the absolute power of jurisdictional leverage during the Great Depression, we have to examine one of the most audacious and calculated legislative moves in American history. In the early 1930s, the United States was collapsing under the weight of massive bank failures and crippling unemployment. Every state in the Union was desperately scrambling to generate revenue, but the state of Nevada took a radically different approach. Nevada was a sparsely populated desert state with virtually no industrial base to rely on when the national economy shattered. So the state legislature looked at the millions of Americans trapped in highly adversarial, fault-based marriages, and they recognized a massive untapped market of desperate consumers. In 1931, Nevada made a ruthless economic calculation. They deliberately weaponized their own state's sovereignty by drastically lowering their residency requirement for divorce to a staggeringly short 6 weeks. Furthermore, they radically expanded the acceptable legal grounds for separation, allowing extreme mental cruelty to be defined by incredibly vague, easily provable complaints. They did not do this out of compassion for failing marriages. They did it to import capital. They essentially created a state-sponsored legal sanctuary, transforming the city of Reno into the divorce capital of the world and birthing the historical phenomenon of the migratory divorce. For the men we discussed previously, the men who were being financially hunted by their local courts and facing the terrifying prospect of debtor prisons due to mathematically impossible alimony judgments, Nevada offered a literal escape hatch. The strategy was an extreme form of what modern attorneys call forum shopping. If the legal rules in a state like New York or Pennsylvania were explicitly designed to extract your remaining wealth and ignore the macroeconomic reality of the Depression, the only logical survival strategy was to stop playing the game in that jurisdiction. Let us examine exactly how this historical loophole was executed by looking at a case study of a man named Thomas, a former civil engineer living in Boston. By 1932, Thomas has lost his firm, his savings are gone, and he is facing a local judge who is heavily leaning toward imputing his former high income to satisfy a massive alimony demand from his estranged wife. Thomas realizes that if the Boston judge finalizes that order, his life is effectively over. He will be permanently enslaved to a debt he cannot pay. So Thomas executes the migratory strategy. He liquidates whatever small physical assets he has left, perhaps selling a vehicle or calling in personal favors to gather cash. He boards a westbound train and entirely abandons his home state. Upon arriving in Reno, Nevada, Thomas rents a room in a specialized boarding house. These boarding houses, and later the famous divorce ranches, were specifically designed to house the massive influx of transient individuals who needed to establish their continuous 6-week physical presence within the state borders. During this 6-week waiting period, Thomas contributes to the local Nevada economy, paying rent, buying food, and injecting his remaining capital into a state that desperately needed it. On day 43, the exact moment his 6-week residency is officially established, Thomas hires a local Reno attorney. This attorney immediately files a petition for divorce in the local county court, citing the incredibly lenient Nevada standard of mental cruelty. This is where the legal mechanics become truly astonishing, utilizing a mechanism known as an ex parte proceeding. An ex parte legal action is one brought by one person in the absence of the other party. Because Thomas's wife is thousands of miles away in Boston, she is not physically present to defend herself or contest the divorce. Under Nevada law at the time, Thomas only had to prove that he made a reasonable effort to notify her. This notification requirement was frequently satisfied by simply publishing a tiny, obscure legal notice in a local Nevada newspaper, a publication that his wife in Massachusetts would absolutely never see. When the court date arrives just days later, Thomas stands before a Nevada judge. The judge, whose entire local economy relies on processing these cases rapidly and favorably, listens to Thomas state that his wife nagged him and caused him mental distress. The judge immediately strikes the gavel, fully dissolves the marriage, and crucially, issues a final decree that completely severs all future financial obligations. In less than 2 months, Thomas has legally erased the impending Boston alimony judgment and completely freed himself from the extraction machine. Imagine if right now, in the highly unpredictable economic environment of the year 2026, you were facing a massive life-altering financial judgment in a California or New York family court. Imagine if you discovered that by simply moving to a specific remote county in South Dakota for exactly 45 days, you could access a completely different set of state laws that would legally override and completely nullify the judgment threatening to destroy your life. You would likely consider making that move immediately. That is the exact level of desperate legal arbitrage that thousands of men were executing during the depths of the Great Depression. They recognized that the law was not a rigid, national monolith, but a fragmented system of competing jurisdictions. By physically moving their bodies across state lines, they fundamentally altered the legal framework governing their assets, their freedom, and their futures. However, the legal war was far from over. The sudden mass exodus of tax-paying men, and the massive loss of potential alimony revenue, sent the local governments and the opposing family law attorneys in the eastern states into an absolute panic. They were watching their most lucrative targets simply board trains and vanish, returning months later waving a piece of paper from Nevada that claimed they were legally untouchable. The home states realized that if they allowed these migratory divorces to stand, their entire system of financial extraction would completely collapse. They could not allow a rogue state like Nevada to dictate the family law of the entire country. So the highly aggressive attorneys back east launched a massive coordinated legal counterattack, and they targeted the very foundational document of the United States. They utilized Article 4, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, known as the Full Faith and Credit Clause. This clause generally requires that states must respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. The opposing lawyers argued that Nevada was manufacturing fake residencies, and that these ex parte divorces were legally fraudulent. They instructed their clients to completely ignore the Nevada decrees, and to continue prosecuting the men in their home states for desertion, unpaid alimony, and even criminal abandonment. This created an unprecedented legal paradox that trapped thousands of men in a terrifying, completely unforeseen nightmare. A man could step off a train in New York, holding a completely valid, state-sanctioned divorce decree from Nevada, only to be immediately arrested by local police. To the state of Nevada, he was a legally free single man. But to the state of New York, he was a married man maliciously fleeing his financial obligations, and worse, if he had remarried while out west, he was now facing severe felony charges for a specific, highly destructive crime. We are going to break down exactly how the Supreme Court stepped in to settle this chaotic jurisdictional warfare, the devastating legal trap that caught thousands of men who thought they had successfully escaped, and why failing to understand the limits of jurisdictional borders can result in the total catastrophic loss of everything you have fought to protect. The legal collision between the sovereign state of Nevada and the highly aggressive eastern states created a constitutional crisis that completely shattered the lives of thousands of men who believed they had successfully outsmarted the system. To understand how a man could hold a totally valid state-sanctioned legal document in his hand and still be thrown into a penitentiary, we have to look at how the United States Supreme Court ultimately intervened to resolve this unprecedented jurisdictional warfare. When the home states realized they were bleeding potential alimony revenue and losing their grip on their male citizens, they did not just argue that the Nevada divorces were unfair. They launched a highly coordinated, multi-state legal campaign arguing that the Nevada divorces were fundamentally fraudulent based on a highly specific, easily misunderstood legal concept regarding physical location. That concept is the critical difference between legal residency and legal domicile, and failing to understand this distinction was the exact trapdoor that swung open beneath these men. Legal residency simply means you are physically present in a location for a set amount of time. You can be a resident of a hotel for a week. But legal domicile is an entirely different, vastly more powerful concept. Domicile requires not just physical presence, but the absolute, provable intention to remain in that specific location permanently and indefinitely. It is your true, fixed, and permanent home to which you intend to return whenever you are absent. The eastern states aggressively argued before the highest courts that these men traveling to Reno were merely establishing temporary residency to exploit a 6-week legal loophole, but they possessed absolutely no genuine intent to establish a permanent Nevada domicile. The home states pointed out the undeniable fact that almost every single one of these men purchased round-trip train tickets. They left their clothes in their closets back in New York or Pennsylvania. They did not attempt to secure long-term employment in the desert. They simply waited out the clock in a specialized boarding house, collected their decree, and immediately boarded the very next train heading back east. Because their intent was never to stay, the eastern courts ruled that the men had committed extreme jurisdictional fraud. Therefore, the home state retained absolute legal authority to completely ignore the Nevada decree, as if it had never been printed. Let us examine the devastating historical reality of this ruling through a specific case study. Consider a man named William, a former high-earning stockbroker living in Manhattan. After the crash of 1929, William is facing total financial ruin and a mathematically impossible alimony demand from an intensely hostile estranged wife. He scrapes together his last remaining dollars, borrows against his life insurance policy, and flees to Reno. He completes his 6 weeks, secures his ex parte divorce decree, and feels an overwhelming sense of liberation. Believing he is finally a legally free man, William actually remarries a woman he meets out west and attempts to start his life over. A few months later, hoping the dust has settled and needing to find work in his former industry, William returns to New York with his new bride. The moment William steps off the train in Manhattan, he is walking directly into a perfectly engineered, devastating legal ambush. His first wife's attorney, utilizing the newly established Supreme Court precedents regarding domicile, has already petitioned the local New York judge to invalidate the Nevada decree. To the state of New York, William is still legally married to his first wife. But the legal nightmare does not stop at simple invalidation. Because William married a second woman while technically still married to the first in the eyes of New York law, the opposing counsel escalates the civil family dispute into a severe criminal prosecution. Local authorities arrest William right there in the city. He is not merely sued for back alimony. He is indicted on felony charges of bigamy and criminal adultery. The strategy was brutally effective. By threatening William with a severe criminal conviction and years in a state penitentiary, the opposing counsel created an unbearable amount of leverage. They would offer to quietly drop the criminal charges and recognize the divorce, but only if William agreed to sign away every single remaining asset he possessed, liquidate any hidden wealth, and bind himself to an inescapable, lifelong extortionate alimony contract. William had spent his very last dollar attempting to secure a legal escape hatch, only to return home entirely broke, criminally prosecuted, and subjected to a financial extraction vastly more severe than the one he originally fled. The psychological terror of this scenario was absolute. Men realized that geographical borders were not magic shields, and the reach of an incentivized, hostile family court could extend across the entire continent, dragging them back to face a judge who was now actively furious that they had attempted to bypass his authority. Imagine if you are navigating a highly complex legal separation right now, in the modern landscape of the year 2026. Imagine you are living in a high-tax, high-regulation state like California, and your business is suffering. You decide to physically relocate yourself and your entire corporate structure to Texas, securing a Texas state ruling that protects your remaining capital and finalizes your separation under much more favorable local laws. You believe you are completely protected. Now imagine flying back to Los Angeles to visit family for the holidays, only to be detained at the airport. You discover that the California courts ruled your move to Texas was a fraudulent attempt to evade their jurisdiction, because you kept a gym membership active in Los Angeles and did not immediately sell your California property. Imagine discovering that California completely invalidated your Texas rulings, froze all of your modern banking accounts, and issued a bench warrant for your arrest due to unpaid, newly calculated arrears. That specific sheer terror of jurisdictional overlap is the exact legacy inherited from the battles of the Great Depression. When the migratory divorce loophole was slammed shut by these aggressive domicile tests and the terrifying threat of bigamy prosecutions, the men of the 1930s realized that running away was no longer a viable survival strategy. They could not physically escape the jurisdiction of their home courts, which meant they had to stay and fight a brutal, defensive war on their own soil. But by the time they realized this, the opposing attorneys had already adapted once again. If a man could not flee, and he had successfully hidden his liquid cash from the collapsing banking system, the courts had to target the one massive, undeniable asset that a man could absolutely never put in his pocket and carry across state lines. They turned their highly incentivized, aggressive legal machinery toward the concept of real estate, physical property, and the family home. Prior to the 1930s, the name written on a property deed was considered the absolute, undisputed law of the land. If a man purchased a farm or a townhouse solely in his own name, utilizing his own capital, the historical precedent heavily favored his absolute retention of that property upon separation. But the sheer economic desperation of the Great Depression forced the family court system to radically innovate a new method of legally seizing physical dirt. They developed a legal fiction so powerful that it could completely erase a man's name from his own property deed, instantly transferring the wealth he had spent a lifetime building into the hands of his estranged spouse, leaving him homeless and deeply in debt. We are about to dissect the specific ruthless legal mechanism known as the constructive trust, how courts used it to fundamentally redefine the concept of ownership, and why understanding this exact historical shift is absolutely critical to protecting your physical assets from total liquidation today. To understand the sheer destructive force of the constructive trust during the 1930s, you must first understand the absolute, historical sanctity of the property deed prior to the economic collapse. For generations, the American legal system, built heavily upon English common law, operated on a very simple and rigid premise regarding physical property. The name written in ink on the title was the undisputed, absolute owner of the dirt, the timber, and the structure built upon it. If a man utilized his own capital, earned from his own labor, to purchase a parcel of real estate, that asset was his sovereign territory. During the prosperous years of the Roaring Twenties, if a marriage dissolved, the physical property typically remained entirely with the title holder. The concept of dividing a man's home simply because his marriage failed was considered a massive overreach of judicial power. But when the Great Depression systematically eradicated liquid cash, destroyed the stock market, and made it entirely impossible for men to pay mathematically absurd alimony judgments, the family court system faced a massive crisis. The opposing attorneys were suddenly staring at men who possessed absolutely zero liquid wealth but were still living inside paid-off, physical homes. The courts needed a legal mechanism to bypass the ironclad nature of the property deed, and they found it by weaponizing a deeply obscure, highly complex concept from the courts of equity known as the constructive trust. A constructive trust is not a physical document you sign at a bank. It is a total legal fiction, a retroactive ruling invented by a judge to forcefully seize an asset from the legal owner and hand it to someone else. The justification for this extreme maneuver was based entirely on the concept of preventing unjust enrichment. The opposing lawyers began aggressively arguing that even though the husband was the sole earner and the sole name on the deed, the wife had unknowingly invested invisible capital into the property. They argued that her domestic labor, her maintenance of the household, or even incredibly minor financial contributions like purchasing daily groceries freed up the husband's capital, allowing him to pay the mortgage. Therefore, the lawyers claimed, the wife had built invisible, unrecorded sweat equity in the property, and allowing the husband to keep the entire home would unjustly enrich him at her expense. Let us examine exactly how this terrifying legal fiction was executed by looking at the historical case study of a man we will call James, a moderately successful pharmacist living in Ohio. In 1924, James uses his own savings, accumulated long before he ever met his wife, to purchase a respectable home outright. The deed is exclusively in his name. Fast forward to 1933. The economy is in shambles, James's pharmacy is barely surviving, and his highly contentious marriage violently ends in a fault-based divorce. James walks into the courtroom completely confident in his asset protection strategy. He has no liquid cash for the court to seize, his business is technically worthless on paper, and he holds the physical title to his home, believing it is absolutely untouchable. But his wife's attorney does not ask for cash. Instead, the attorney brings in a parade of local witnesses. The neighbor testifies that the wife spent the summers painting the exterior fence. The local grocer testifies that the wife occasionally used her own small inheritance to buy food for the household when times were tight. Based entirely on these incredibly minor circumstantial contributions, the judge strikes the gavel and declares that a constructive trust has been instantly formed. The judge rules that James is no longer the sole owner of his home. He is merely holding the property in trust for the benefit of his estranged wife, who is now deemed to legally own 50% of the physical equity. But in the depths of the Great Depression, you cannot simply cut a house in half, and James absolutely does not possess the cash to buy out her newly invented share. So, the court orders the immediate, forced liquidation of the property at a public auction. Because the real estate market is completely crashed, the home sells for pennies on the dollar to a local bank. The wife takes her court-ordered half of the meager proceeds, and James, who entered the courtroom owning a paid-off home, walks out utterly destitute, entirely homeless, and stripped of the single greatest asset he ever accumulated. His piece of paper, his legally binding deed, was completely incinerated by the judge's sudden interpretation of equitable fairness. Imagine if you are navigating a volatile separation right now, in the current year 2026. You are a successful man who purchased a home solely in your name years before you ever got married. You meticulously kept the title separate, believing you had engaged in flawless asset protection. But during the course of your marriage, your spouse occasionally buys the groceries, or pays the utility bill from her separate account, or spends a few weekends helping you completely renovate the master bathroom. Imagine walking into a modern family court assuming your premarital home is perfectly safe, only to watch the opposing counsel deploy the exact same legal framework forged during the 1930s. They argue that your spouse's minor financial contributions commingled with your asset, creating a massive, equitable interest. The judge agrees, pierces your sole ownership, forces the sale of your home in an unpredictable 2026 housing market, and completely liquidates the wealth you thought was fully protected. This is the exact enduring legacy of the constructive trust. It is the absolute destruction of strict property rights in favor of judicial discretion. You must understand the macroeconomic reality of why the judges of the Great Depression were so incredibly eager to utilize this legal fiction. It was not about actual fairness. It was about the brutal mechanics of state survival. The state and municipal welfare systems of the era were completely bankrupt. Local governments were collapsing under the weight of massive public poverty. If a judge allowed a divorced woman to walk away with nothing, she would immediately become a ward of the state, requiring food, housing, and financial assistance from a government that possessed absolutely no money. The judges were under immense, unspoken political pressure to prevent this from happening at all costs. By inventing constructive trusts and forcing the liquidation of the husband's real estate, the courts were essentially transferring the heavy financial burden of social welfare directly onto the shoulders of the individual man. It was a highly coordinated state-sanctioned wealth redistribution program, disguised as standard family law. When men finally woke up to the horrifying reality that their deeds were essentially worthless, and that the family courts could simply invent invisible trusts to seize their homes and farms, a profound and terrifying shift in strategy occurred. They realized that defending their property in a rigged legal system was entirely pointless. If the court was inevitably going to force the sale of the house and give the proceeds to a hostile spouse, the men decided there would simply be no proceeds left to take. They initiated a massive underground campaign of intentional financial sabotage. They stopped maintaining the properties, they aggressively loaded the homes with manufactured, highly complex debt structures, and in some extreme historical case studies, they engaged in the literal physical destruction of their own assets just to ensure the opposing counsel got absolutely nothing. We are about to map out this terrifying scorched earth strategy, exactly how men legally and physically hollowed out their own wealth right before the courts could seize it, and the massive catastrophic legal consequences of attempting to destroy what the judge already believes belongs to someone else. The psychological leap required to intentionally destroy your own life's work is profoundly difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Yet, during the darkest years of the Great Depression, thousands of men made the calculated, chilling decision that mutual financial annihilation was strategically superior to absolute surrender. Once the legal precedent of the constructive trust was fully established, men realized that the family court system was no longer just dividing assets. It was actively hunting them. The home, the family farm, and the small business were no longer viewed as safe havens or personal achievements. They were massive, highly visible targets painted directly on a man's back. Faced with the mathematical certainty that a judge was going to force the liquidation of their property and hand the proceeds to a hostile opposing counsel, a massive demographic of desperate men initiated the scorched earth protocol. If the system was going to strip them of everything they owned to prevent a divorced wife from becoming a burden on the collapsing state welfare system, then these men were going to ensure that the state inherited nothing but absolute ruins. The first and most sophisticated layer of this defensive destruction involved the aggressive weaponization of imaginary debt. Men understood that a court could easily seize physical equity, but equity is simply the value of an asset minus the liabilities attached to it. Therefore, if a man could artificially inflate his liabilities to absolutely eclipse the value of his property, the equity would instantly drop to zero, leaving the opposing counsel with nothing to extract. This birthed the historical trend of the friendly foreclosure and the fraudulent promissory note. Let us examine the historical case study of a man named Henry, a moderately successful dairy farmer in Wisconsin in 1934. Henry owns his farm outright, a massive vulnerability in a fault-based divorce. Anticipating a brutal legal separation, Henry does not try to hide his money. Instead, he approaches a highly trusted, lifelong friend or a distant male relative. Henry quietly drafts a massive, legally binding promissory note, essentially a fake loan document, claiming he borrowed a massive sum of money from this friend years prior to the economic crash. To secure this completely fabricated loan, Henry deliberately places a massive lien directly against his own farm. On paper, the farm is now mathematically worthless, entirely swallowed by this newly manufactured debt. When Henry is dragged into family court, his wife's attorney inevitably attempts to utilize a constructive trust to seize the agricultural property. Henry simply hands the judge the manufactured lien. He successfully argues that the farm is already spoken for, legally promised to a senior creditor. In extreme historical scenarios, the trusted friend would literally foreclose on Henry's farm, taking official legal ownership of the property to completely shield it from the family court system, with a secret handshake agreement to return the deed to Henry once the divorce was finalized and the ex-wife was out of the picture. But paper sabotage was only the beginning. When men lacked the sophisticated network required to execute a friendly foreclosure, they resorted to the visceral, literal destruction of the physical asset itself. Historians have documented massive waves of deliberate, strategic deferred maintenance and active property sabotage during the 1930s. Men who knew they were going to lose their homes would systematically gut the value of the structures before the court-ordered auction could ever take place. They would completely stop paying property taxes, ensuring the county would eventually seize the land, effectively beating the family court to the punch. They would strip valuable copper wiring from the walls, remove high-end plumbing fixtures, and quietly sell off critical structural components for pennies on the black market. In agricultural communities, men would deliberately overwork the soil, sell off the most vital, income-producing livestock in the dead of night, and leave heavy, expensive farm machinery out in the harsh winter elements to rust and permanently seize up. They were legally required to hand over the asset, but they ensured they were handing over a completely hollowed-out, worthless shell. Imagine if you are going through a brutal, high-conflict separation right now, in the highly digitized economy of the year 2026. You are the sole founder of a moderately successful software startup. You know the family court is preparing to aggressively evaluate your business, assign it a massive valuation, and force you to buy out your spouse's newly invented equitable share with cash you do not have. Imagine making the terrifying, destructive decision to deliberately tank your own company, just to spite the opposing counsel. You intentionally alienate your biggest clients. You quietly transfer your most valuable intellectual property to an offshore holding company owned by a college roommate, and you deliberately miss critical tax filings to trigger crippling federal audits. You walk into the modern family court in 2026, present a completely bankrupt balance sheet, and declare that the business is worthless. You have successfully prevented the opposing counsel from extracting your wealth, but you have also entirely immolated your own professional future in the process. This strategy of mutual destruction was incredibly common during the Great Depression, but it was also the single most dangerous legal game a man could possibly play, because the family court judges were not fools. When the courts realized that millions of dollars in marital assets were suddenly vanishing into thin air, they developed the legal doctrine of fraudulent conveyance and the dissipation of assets. If a judge even suspected that Henry's promissory note to his friend was a sham, or if the court discovered that a man had deliberately stripped the copper from his own home, the legal retaliation was absolutely catastrophic. The judge would completely invalidate the fake debt, pierce the protective veil of the friendly foreclosure, and prosecute the husband and his accomplices for severe financial fraud. Furthermore, the court would calculate the exact historical value of the asset before it was intentionally destroyed, and they would assign that massive phantom dollar amount directly to the husband's side of the ledger. You could burn your own farm to the ground, but the court would still legally order you to pay your ex-wife half the value of a fully functioning farm. If you could not produce the cash for the farm you just destroyed, you were held in absolute civil contempt and immediately thrown into a debtor prison. Men were literally being incarcerated for destroying things that had their own names written on the title. The scorched earth strategy ultimately trapped men in a paradox of their own making. If they kept the asset, the court seized it. If they destroyed the asset, the court imprisoned them for the lost value. With their liquid cash evaporated by the bank runs, their future income weaponized against them through imputed historical earnings, and their physical property effectively trapped by the doctrine of dissipation, the men of the 1930s were completely cornered. The financial battleground had been entirely salted. But when the money finally ran out, and there was absolutely nothing left for the opposing attorneys to mathematically extract, the legal warfare did not stop. It merely shifted to the most primal, devastating, and emotionally destructive arena possible. The courts turned their attention toward the children. We are about to decode the terrifying realities of the tender years doctrine, how the total collapse of the economy permanently altered the legal framework of child custody, and exactly how men lost entire generations of their own bloodlines to a system that explicitly viewed fatherhood solely as a financial utility. To comprehend the absolute devastation inflicted upon fathers during the Great Depression, you must understand a legal concept that completely dominated the family courts of the era, known as the tender years doctrine. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, family law actually heavily favored the father in matters of custody. In an agrarian society, older children were viewed as vital economic assets, necessary labor for the family farm or the family trade. Therefore, when a marriage dissolved, the father retained the physical property and the children remained with him to work the land. However, as society industrialized and families moved into crowded urban centers, children transitioned from being economic assets into massive financial liabilities. They required housing, clothing, and schooling in cities where space was at an absolute premium. To adapt to this massive societal shift, the legal system adopted the tender years doctrine, a rigid, inflexible presumption that mothers were biologically and morally superior caregivers for children under the age of 13. During the prosperous decades leading up to the 1930s, this doctrine was relatively unchallenged because men were generally capable of securing employment to fund the separate household. But when the United States economy violently collapsed, the tender years doctrine mutated into a weapon of mass familial destruction. When a man walked into a courtroom in 1933, completely stripped of his savings, his employment, and his physical property by the legal mechanisms we have already discussed, he was facing a judge who viewed him through a deeply cynical, purely utilitarian lens. The family court system of the Great Depression did not view a father as an emotional anchor, a moral guide, or a necessary psychological presence in a child's life. The court viewed the father exclusively as a financial utility. He was a machine built by society to generate capital. Because the macroeconomy had completely failed, the man was currently broken and unable to generate that capital. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, the man possessed absolutely zero value to his own bloodline. Let us examine the brutal mechanics of this system through a historical case study. Consider a man named Richard, a highly skilled union carpenter living in Philadelphia in 1934. The construction industry has completely evaporated. Richard has lost everything, and his highly contentious marriage ends in a fault-based divorce. Richard desperately petitions the court for shared physical custody of his two young sons. He argues that since he is currently unemployed, he possesses an abundance of time to care for, educate, and raise his children while his ex-wife attempts to find piecemeal work. The judge absolutely rejects this logical argument. Relying strictly on the tender years doctrine, the court awards sole physical and legal custody to the mother. The judge then calculates a rigid child support obligation based on Richard's previous, pre-depression union wages. This is the exact moment the trap snaps shut. The court grants Richard the right to visitation, perhaps alternating Sundays, but they legally attach his access to his children directly to his financial compliance. The court essentially establishes a biological paywall. When Richard inevitably fails to make the mathematically impossible support payments, the opposing counsel immediately files a motion for civil contempt. The judge does not care that the construction industry is dead. The judge views Richard's failure to pay as a deliberate, malicious abandonment of his paternal duties. As punishment, the court suspends Richard's visitation rights. The legal system explicitly communicates to Richard that his love, his time, and his physical presence are entirely worthless if they are not accompanied by a physical dollar bill. He is legally severed from his own children, forced to become a ghost in his own city, watching his family walk down the street from afar while fearing arrest if he attempts to make contact without clearing his massive financial arrears. Imagine if right now, in the highly volatile economic landscape of the year 2026, a man named Michael is navigating a modern custody dispute. Michael was a highly paid tech executive who just lost his entire career to a massive wave of corporate downsizing and artificial intelligence automation. He is surviving on rapidly depleting savings and struggling to pivot to a new industry. He walks into a modern family court, asking for equal 50-50 parenting time with his young daughter. But the opposing counsel successfully argues that Michael is emotionally unstable due to his sudden unemployment, while the mother has a stable, lower-paying job. The court awards primary custody to the mother and orders Michael to pay thousands of dollars a month in support, imputing his former tech salary using the exact same historical precedents established in the 1930s. When Michael misses a payment because his savings run dry, the state immediately suspends his driver's license, seizes his passport, and restricts his parenting time. Michael realizes that in the year 2026, his fatherhood is still being treated as a conditional, heavily monitored financial transaction. The systemic reduction of a father to a mere wallet is not a relic of the past. It is the enduring legacy of the Great Depression. For the men of the 1930s, this biological severance created an inescapable, maddening paradox. If a father decided to stay local, remaining in his home city to try and secure whatever meager scraps of visitation the hostile court allowed, he was effectively choosing to remain unemployed. By remaining unemployed in a dead local economy, he guaranteed that he would default on his court-ordered payments, which guaranteed he would eventually be thrown into a county jail for civil contempt, thus losing access to his children anyway. Conversely, if a father made the deeply painful decision to leave his home city and travel across the country to places like the Hoover Dam construction site or the agricultural valleys of California to find physical labor, he might actually earn enough money to send back to the court and satisfy the financial demands. But by moving thousands of miles away, he permanently surrendered his physical presence. He geographically abandoned his children, effectively becoming a total stranger who merely mailed a check once a month. There was absolutely no winning move. The family court system had engineered a scenario where a man had to either choose to be an impoverished criminal in his own hometown, or a financially compliant ghost living in a transient camp on the other side of the continent. The sheer psychological terror of being forced to choose between your freedom and your bloodline broke the minds of thousands of previously law-abiding, hard-working American men. They realized that the state governments, lacking the funds to build orphanages or provide social welfare, had entirely weaponized the love a father has for his children, using it as leverage to extract every last drop of physical labor a man could produce under the direct threat of total alienation and physical incarceration. When fatherhood was officially reduced to a mathematically impossible financial transaction, and men realized that the legal system was a machine explicitly designed to grind them into dust and distribute the remains to their hostile spouses, a profound and terrifying breaking point was reached. Millions of men made a cold, calculated decision. If the system was going to relentlessly hunt them for phantom money, imprison them for debts they could not pay, and permanently withhold their children behind an insurmountable financial wall, then they were going to completely stop participating in the system altogether. They were not just going to run away to another state, they were going to entirely erase their own existences. They initiated the most massive coordinated disappearance in American history, building an entirely parallel underground society that operated completely off the grid. Next, we are going to expose exactly how this massive shadow economy functioned, the specific highly illegal methods men used to forge new identities and vanish from the federal record, and why the desperate strategies of the Ghost Network remain one of the most heavily guarded, controversial secrets of the Great Depression. The decision to completely vanish from the formal legal and financial grid of the United States in the early 1930s was not a spontaneous act of rebellion. It was a highly calculated, desperate survival strategy, executed by men who had mathematically exhausted every other legal option. To understand how hundreds of thousands of men successfully built a massive ghost network across the country, you must completely forget the modern surveillance state. During the Great Depression, there was no centralized digital database, no biometric facial recognition, no ubiquitous credit reporting agencies, and critically, no mandatory federal identification numbers tying a man to his historical debts. If a man physically relocated across state lines and simply stopped utilizing his legal birth name, he effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of his local family court. The local sheriffs back east, operating with severely depleted municipal budgets, had absolutely no financial resources to send detectives across the continent to track down a single man who owed back alimony. The warrants for civil contempt simply piled up in dusty filing cabinets, completely unenforceable outside of the immediate county jurisdiction. Let us examine the specific step-by-step mechanics of this historical vanishing act through the case study of a man we will call Charles, a former factory floor manager from Cleveland. By 1934, Charles has been entirely stripped of his assets through the legal invention of the constructive trust. His future wages have been aggressively imputed based on 1928 economic conditions, and he has been denied all access to his children because he cannot pay the mathematically impossible court-ordered support. Facing imminent incarceration in a debtor prison, Charles executes the ultimate geographic reset. He liquidates his last remaining personal items for untraceable physical cash, packs a single duffel bag, and walks down to the local rail yard in the dead of night. He boards a westbound freight train, a highly dangerous but incredibly common practice known as riding the rails. The moment the train crosses the Ohio state line, Charles abandons his legal identity entirely. When Charles steps off the train in a Pacific Northwest logging camp or a massive agricultural Hooverville in the Central Valleys of California, he simply invents a new name. He becomes John or William, an itinerant laborer willing to work brutally long hours for literal pennies. Because there were no W-2 tax forms, no mandatory background checks, and no digital payroll systems, the camp foreman did not care about his history, his marital status, or his legal entanglements back east. They only cared if he could swing an axe or pick fruit. Charles entered a purely cash-based, underground economy. And ironically, the total macroeconomic collapse of the American banking system provided the absolute perfect camouflage for this ghost network. Because thousands of legitimate local banks had completely failed, wiping out the life savings of millions of ordinary citizens, nobody trusted financial institutions. It was entirely normal and socially acceptable for a grown man to operate exclusively in physical cash, hoarding silver coins in his boots or renting a room in a remote boarding house with untraceable paper currency. Charles did not stand out as a fugitive. He blended in perfectly with a massive transient population of displaced American workers. Imagine if right now, in the highly digitized and heavily tracked year 2026, a modern man named David attempts to execute this exact same strategy. David is facing a massive, mathematically impossible judgment in a modern family court, and he decides to simply vanish. The sheer impossibility of his situation highlights the unique historical window of the 1930s. The moment David turns on his smartphone, his GPS location is instantly pinged to cellular towers. If he attempts to withdraw cash to fund his escape, digital banking algorithms flag the massive transaction and local authorities are notified. If he drives his vehicle across state lines, automated license plate readers track his exact geographic movements on the interstate highway system. If he tries to secure a new job under a fake name, modern human resources departments run instantaneous, mandatory federal background checks and mandate the submission of a social security number, immediately alerting the state child support enforcement agencies to his new location and instantly garnishing his modern wages. In the year 2026, the digital dragnet is absolute and inescapable. But during the Great Depression, the vast analog landscape of the American West offered a literal impenetrable fortress for men seeking total financial anonymity. However, the historical trends show that the price of this anonymity was staggeringly high. Surviving within the ghost network required a man to engage in permanent, self-imposed psychological exile. The men who successfully escaped the extraction machines of the Eastern family courts had to accept the devastating reality that they could never, under any circumstances, contact their bloodlines again. Sending a single letter back home, making a single telephone call, or attempting to check on the welfare of their children would instantly provide the opposing counsel with a geographic breadcrumb, destroying the protective veil of their new identity. These men lived the rest of their lives entirely in the shadows, knowing they would never attend their children's weddings, never see their grandchildren, and eventually die in complete obscurity under names they had simply made up on a train ride decades prior. They had successfully protected their physical freedom and their future labor from the crushing grip of the family court system, but they had traded their entire familial legacy to secure it. For years, this massive underground society of undocumented, transient men operated entirely outside the boundaries of the traditional legal system, completely untouchable by the judges and attorneys who had previously ruined their lives. They had successfully found the ultimate loophole in the American family law framework. But the federal government was watching this massive demographic shift, and they realized that a modern industrial nation could not function if millions of its male citizens were completely untrackable and operating entirely off the grid in a shadow economy. The government realized they needed a permanent, inescapable system to log, track, and monitor the financial movements of every single citizen from birth until death. And in the late 1930s, under the guise of an unprecedented national welfare program designed to lift the elderly out of poverty, the United States government quietly engineered the absolute destruction of the ghost network. We are about to dissect the specific, highly controversial rollout of the federal tracking grid, how the sudden implementation of mandatory numerical identification completely trapped the men who had spent years hiding in the shadows, and how the legal and financial dragnet created at the very end of the Great Depression fundamentally permanently transformed the modern family court system into the inescapable extraction machine you face today. The federal dragnet that completely closed the geographic loopholes of the 1930s was not originally designed or marketed as a tool for family courts. In 1935, the United States government passed the Social Security Act. On the surface and in the massive public relations campaigns that followed, this legislation was presented as a compassionate, desperately needed safety net for the elderly and the disabled who had been economically annihilated by the stock market crash. But buried within the administrative mechanics of this sweeping federal program was the single most powerful tracking mechanism ever devised in American history: the mandatory, 9-digit numerical identifier. Prior to this moment, your identity was essentially a localized concept, tied to your physical presence and the people who knew your face. But the implementation of the Social Security number fundamentally changed the relationship between the American citizen and the state. It converted a man from a sovereign individual into a permanently tracked financial entity. To understand how this immediately destroyed the massive ghost network of transient men who had successfully escaped their mathematically impossible alimony judgments, you have to look at the mechanics of employment in the late 1930s. As the United States slowly began to gear up for industrial production leading into the Second World War, legitimate, high-paying jobs returned to the factories and shipyards. But there was a massive, unprecedented catch. To legally work on these assembly lines, to draw a steady paycheck from a major corporation, a man was legally required to register for a federal identification number. The government mandated that employers track and report the wages of every single worker to fund the new federal pension system. Let us examine the catastrophic impact of this shift through the historical case study of a man we will call Arthur. Back in 1932, Arthur executed the ghost network strategy perfectly. He fled a crushing imputed income judgment in Massachusetts, abandoned his legal name, and spent 5 years working exclusively for untraceable physical cash in the agricultural fields of the Pacific Northwest. He is entirely off the grid, living a quiet, isolated existence. But by 1938, the agricultural work dries up, and Arthur wants a stable, high-paying job at a newly opened munitions factory in Seattle. To get the job, Arthur must walk into a federal office, provide his actual birth certificate, and register his true identity to receive his 9-digit number. The absolute moment Arthur registers, his permanent financial exile is over. The localized family court system back in Massachusetts, which previously had absolutely no jurisdiction or visibility into Washington state, eventually gains access to this newly centralized federal database. The opposing counsel, who has been sitting on a massive, accumulating civil contempt warrant for 6 years, instantly locates Arthur. Because his new wages at the munitions factory are systematically reported to the federal government using his specific numerical identifier, the family court executes a highly aggressive, interstate wage garnishment. Arthur does not even receive his first paycheck. The money is intercepted by the state before it ever reaches his hands, forcibly routed back to the eastern jurisdiction to satisfy the massive 6-year-old debt. Arthur realizes that the vast, untrackable expanse of the American West has been permanently fenced in by federal bureaucracy. The ghost network is dead, and the era of the inescapable legal extraction machine has officially begun. Imagine if right now, in the highly regulated digital economy of the year 2026, a man named Robert attempts to completely bypass the modern family court system by converting his entire net worth into decentralized cryptocurrency and fleeing to a foreign country without an extradition treaty. Robert believes he has outsmarted the physical jurisdiction of the United States. He assumes his digital wallet is entirely uncrackable, and his new geographical location protects him from civil contempt. But Robert severely underestimates the modern equivalent of the 1930s federal dragnet. When Robert attempts to actually utilize his digital wealth to purchase housing or food in his new country, he must interact with international cryptocurrency exchanges that enforce highly aggressive compliance protocols. These global financial networks require biometric verification, passport scans, and immediate tax reporting treaties directly linked back to his original United States Social Security number. The moment Robert attempts to convert his hidden digital assets into usable local fiat currency, his identity is flagged, his foreign accounts are completely frozen by international compliance laws, and his exact location is transmitted directly back to the presiding family court judge in his home state. Robert learns the exact same devastating lesson that Arthur learned in 1938. The extraction machine does not rely on local sheriffs anymore. It relies on the absolute, inescapable control of the financial infrastructure itself. The profound, terrifying legacy of the Great Depression is that it completely rewrote the DNA of American family law. Before the economic collapse, a divorce was primarily a division of physical property that a man had already acquired. But the extreme poverty of the 1930s forced the legal system to innovate. Because there was no physical property left to divide, the courts engineered highly aggressive legal fictions to seize a man's future potential. The introduction of imputed income meant a man could be permanently enslaved to his own historical success. The invention of the constructive trust meant that a man's name on a property deed was no longer a shield against judicial seizure. The weaponization of the tender years doctrine reduced fatherhood to a strictly monitored, conditional financial transaction. And finally, the implementation of the federal tracking grid ensured that a man could never again geographically escape his court-ordered debts. These are not archaic laws buried in forgotten historical textbooks. These are the exact, actively utilized legal mechanisms currently operating in every single modern family court in the United States today. The system was forged in the absolute desperation of the worst economic crisis in human history, specifically designed to protect the state welfare system by violently extracting resources from the individual man. When you walk into a courtroom today, you are walking into a battlefield designed by architects who viewed you solely as a liable financial utility. Understanding this history is not about dwelling on the past. It is the absolute prerequisite for your modern survival. You cannot protect your assets, your business, or your bloodline if you do not fundamentally understand the exact mechanical nature of the traps waiting for you. The men of the 1930s were caught completely by surprise. They trusted the banks, they trusted their property deeds, and they trusted a legal system that ultimately devoured them to save itself. You do not have the luxury of that ignorance. You must view your current financial architecture through the lens of a highly adversarial system that possesses 100 years of institutional experience in wealth extraction. But knowing how the machine operates is only the first half of the survival equation. While the system has spent the last century perfecting its methods of extraction, a highly specialized, elite tier of legal and financial strategists has spent that exact same century developing highly complex defense mechanisms. If the courts can use legal fictions to seize your wealth, you can use highly structured corporate entities and irrevocable offshore trusts to completely legally detach yourself from your own capital long before a petition is ever filed. If the system demands visibility into your assets, you can utilize complex, multi-jurisdictional privacy strategies to legally render your wealth invisible to local subpoenas. The historical trends show that those who anticipate the legal strike survive, while those who react are decimated. The strategies that actually protect men today require a profound understanding of modern corporate law, international arbitrage, and aggressive proactive structuring. In the next phase of our comprehensive masterclass, we are going to completely pivot from historical analysis to modern, actionable defense. We will reveal the exact, step-by-step legal frameworks that high-net-worth men use right now to completely neutralize the family court extraction machine before the legal battle even begins. You will learn how to own nothing on paper while controlling absolutely everything, but only if you are ready to completely abandon your traditional understanding of ownership.